In the depths of the misty mountains, where the ancient kingdom of Khazad-dûm once echoed with the songs of hammers upon anvil, there dwelt a dwarf unlike any other. His name was Thorek Goldsbane, son of Nali, and he bore a burden that would have seemed madness to his kinfolk. He despised gold with every fiber of his being. The halls of Erebor had not seen such a peculiar soul in all the ages since Durin's awakening. Where other dwarves gazed upon the precious metal with eyes aflame with desire, Thorek turned away, as if from poison. His beard, though magnificent and black as midnight, bore not a single thread of gold, and his axes were wrought of the finest steel, unmarked by any golden ornament. "Madness," whispered the elders of his clan. "The gold sickness has taken him in reverse." But they knew not the truth of his affliction, nor the ancient curse that bound his bloodline to this strange fate. It had begun 3 generations past, when his great-grandfather Nali the Greedy had delved too deep beneath the lonely mountain, seeking a vein of gold spoken of in the most secret of dwarvish lore. There, in chambers that predated even the coming of Durin's folk, he had disturbed something that should have remained buried. A voice had spoken from the darkness, not of dragon nor of orc, but of something far older and more terrible. "Let gold be thy bane, as it has been the bane of all who covet it beyond reason," the voice had hissed. "Let thy line know the weight of this curse. That which ye love most shall become thy greatest torment." Nali had paid no heed, thinking it but the ravings of some mad spirit. But when he returned with his golden prize, the curse began to manifest. His son Oyen found gold to burn his flesh at the slightest touch. Oyen's son Glóin could not bear to look upon it without weeping. And now Thorek, the last of that line, felt such revulsion toward gold that its mere presence brought him physical pain. Thus it was that on this gray morning, as autumn mists clung to the peaks of the lonely mountain, Thorek made a decision that would shake the very foundations of dwarvish society. He would seek out the source of his family's curse and break it, even if it meant venturing into the deepest, darkest places of Middle-earth. He gathered his belongings, his twin axes, grief and woe, his coat of steel mail, and provisions for a long journey. But he left behind all the wealth his family had accumulated over generations, for he could not bear to touch a single piece of it. As he departed Erebor under cover of darkness, the great gates closing behind him with a sound like thunder, Thorek did not know that his quest would lead him to places undreamed of, and to a truth that would change not only his own fate, but the destiny of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. The road stretched before him, winding down from the mountain toward the edge of Mirkwood, where shadows danced and ancient evils stirred. And in those shadows, something watched his departure, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. 7 days had passed since Thorek left the safety of Erebor's halls, and now he stood at the eaves of Mirkwood, where the trees grew thick and the very air seemed to whisper of danger. The forest had changed much since the days when it was called Greenwood the Great, and even after the defeat of the necromancer, shadows still lingered in its depths. It was here that he first encountered them, the rangers of Ravania, those hardy men who patrolled the borders of the wood and kept watch against the return of evil. They came upon him as he made camp by a small stream, their approach so silent that even his dwarvish senses failed to detect them until they chose to reveal themselves. "Hold, dwarf," spoke their leader, a tall man with gray eyes and a weathered face marked by years of service in the wild. "I am Aldric, son of Aldwin, and these are my brothers in arms. What brings one of Durin's folk to walk alone in these perilous lands?" Thorek studied the men carefully. They bore themselves with the quiet confidence of those who had faced great dangers and survived. Their cloaks were travel-stained and their weapons well used, but there was honor in their bearing that reminded him of the noble men of Dale. "I am Thorek Goldsbane," he replied, using the epithet that had become his name among his own people. "I seek passage through these woods to reach the gray mountains beyond, where I must complete a task laid upon me by ancient bonds." Aldrich's eyes narrowed at the mention of the dwarf's surname. Goldsbane, a strange name for one of your people, who are known to love gold above all things, save perhaps their beards. Aye, strange indeed, Thorek agreed, and something in his tone warned the ranger not to press further on that matter. But names often carry truths that their bearers would rather keep hidden. The rangers exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless way of men who had long fought side by side. Finally, Aldrich nodded. We too journey northward, for there have been troubling signs in the forest. Orcs move in greater numbers than we have seen since the War of the Ring, and there are other things stirring in the deep places. Perhaps it would be wise if we traveled together for a time. Thus began an unlikely alliance between the gold-hating dwarf and the rangers of Rovanion. As they made their way through the twisted paths of Mirkwood, Thorek learned much of what had transpired in Middle-earth since the Great War. The rangers spoke of growing darkness in the east, of strange lights seen dancing over the Sea of Rune, and of whispers that spoke of the return of ancient powers that had slumbered since the Elder Days. On the third night of their journey together, as they camped in a grove where the trees grew less thick and starlight could filter through the canopy, Aldrich approached Thorek as he sat sharpening his axe. "There is something you should know," the ranger said quietly. "We did not encounter you by chance. We have been watching you since you left Erebor, for word has come to us from Lothlorien that one would come from the mountain realm, bearing a burden of ancient making." Thorek's hands stilled on his whetstone. What word? From whom? From the Lady Galadriel herself. Ere she departed over the sea, she spoke of a curse laid down in the deeps of the earth, and of one who would rise to break it. She said that his path would be fraught with peril, and that he would need aid from unexpected quarters. The dwarf was silent for a long moment, staring into the flickering flames of their small fire. And what else did he say? Aldrich hesitated, then spoke the words that had been given. She said that the curse was not what it seemed, and that breaking it would require a sacrifice greater than gold, greater even than life itself. She said that when the time came, the choice would rest with you alone, and that the fate of more than one people hung in the balance. As if summoned by these ominous words, a wind rose in the forest, setting the leaves to rustling with a sound like distant voices. And somewhere in that whispering chorus, Thorek thought he heard his name called by a voice he recognized, the same voice that had cursed his great-grandfather in the depths beneath Erebor. The quest had truly begun. Beyond the borders of Mirkwood, where the land opened into the wide plains of Rovanion, stood ruins that few now remembered. The rangers called it Framsburg, after the great king who had slain Skatha the Worm in the early days of the Third Age. But Thorek's knowledge of ancient lore ran deeper, and he knew its older name, Vidugavia, the wood hall of the Eotheod, before they rode south to become the Rohirrim. It was here that their path had led them, following signs that Aldrich's rangers had been tracking for many leagues. Orc raids had been emanating from this region, but not random acts of violence. These attacks followed a pattern, as if the creatures were seeking something specific among the scattered settlements of the region. As they crested the hill that overlooked the ancient city, Thorek felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. The ruins spread before them like broken teeth, and among the fallen stones, shapes moved that were not entirely natural. The air itself seemed thick with malevolence, and his axes seemed to grow heavier at his side. "By the Valar," whispered one of the younger rangers, a man named Baldur whose father had ridden with the Rohirrim at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. "What evil has taken root here?" Aldrich raised his hand for silence, his experienced eyes scanning the ruins below. "Orcs, certainly, but not alone. Do you see how the shadows move wrong? There is sorcery at work here, and not of the lesser kind." Thorek studied the scene with the careful eye of one trained in the deep lore of his people. Among the broken walls and fallen towers, he could see the telltale signs of excavation. Great piles of earth had been moved, and in several places, holes had been dug deep into the ground. "They seek something buried," he said, "something old and powerful. The question is whether they have found it." As if in answer to his words, A horn sounded from within the ruins, not the crude brass of orc make, but something far more ancient and terrible. The sound seemed to reach into their very souls and twist, bringing with it visions of darkness and despair. The rangers drew their swords, but Thorek placed a restraining hand on Aldrich's arm. "Steel will not serve us here," he said grimly. "This is a power from the elder days, when the world was young and terrible things walked beneath the stars. We must be cunning as well as brave." Under cover of the deepening twilight, they made their way down into the ruin. The city had once been great. That much was clear from the scope of the destruction. Massive stone blocks lay tumbled about like a child's toys, and in several places, the very ground had been cracked and split by some tremendous force. As they moved deeper into the ruins, following paths that ran between broken walls and collapsed towers, Thorek began to recognize symbols carved into the stone, runes that predated even the ancient alphabet of his own people. They spoke of binding and imprisonment, of powers contained and held in check by the will of those who had built this place. This was not merely a city, he whispered to Aldrich as they paused beside a section of wall covered in the ancient markings. It was a prison, and I fear that what was imprisoned here has been freed. Before the ranger could reply, they heard voices approaching, the harsh, guttural speech of orcs. But underneath it, something else, a sound like singing, but wrong, as if a beautiful melody had been twisted into something obscene. They pressed themselves against the ruined wall and watched as a procession emerged from the deepest part of the ruin. Orcs there were in great number, but they were led by a figure that made even Thorek's stout heart quail. Tall it was, and wrapped in shadows that seemed to move independently of any wind. Its face was hidden beneath a hood that appeared to be cut from the very fabric of night itself. But it was what the figure carried that caused Thorek to grip his axes until his knuckles showed white. In its hands was a crown of gold, blazing with an inner fire that hurt to look upon. And as the dwarf gazed upon it, he felt the familiar revulsion rise within him. But this time, it was mixed with something else. Recognition. He had seen that crown before, in the deepest dreams that came to him in the dark hours before dawn. It was the source of his family's curse, the thing that his great-grandfather had disturbed in the deeps beneath Erebor. And now it was free, carried by a being of shadow and malice toward some purpose that boded ill for all the world. The procession passed them by and vanished into the ruins beyond, but its destination was clear. They were heading north, toward the Grey Mountains and the ancient dwarf holds that lay beyond. Thorek turned to Aldrich, and the ranger saw in the dwarf's eyes a determination that burned like forge fire. "We must follow them," Thorek said. "Whatever evil has been awakened here, it seeks something in the mountains of my people. And I fear that when it finds what it seeks, the curse that has plagued my line will be as nothing compared to the darkness that will be unleashed upon the world." 3 days' hard riding brought them to the borders of the Grey Mountain, where the peaks rose like ancient sentinels against the northern sky. Here, at the ruins of an old watchtower built by the men of Dale in happier times, they encountered a figure that brought both hope and foreboding to their heart. He appeared as if from the very air itself, a gray-cloaked wanderer leaning upon a staff, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing eyes that held depths of wisdom and sorrow. Though he bore no crown and claimed no title, there was no mistaking the power that radiated from his presence. "Mithrandir," Aldrich breathed, and he and his rangers knelt in reverence. But the Grey Wizard raised his hand gently. "Rise, faithful guardians of Rovanian. These are not times for ceremony, but for swift counsel and swifter action." His gaze fell upon Thorek, and the dwarf felt as if those ancient eyes could see into the very depths of his soul. "And you, son of Nali's line, you have traveled far from the halls of your fathers. You know me?" Thorek asked, surprised despite himself. Gandalf smiled, but there was little warmth in it. "I know many things, Thorek Goldsbane. I know of the curse that binds your bloodline, and I know of the shadow that now walks free in the world. More importantly, I know why these two things are connected, and why your path has led you to this place at this time." The wizard gestured for them to follow him into the shelter of the ruined tower, where the wind could not carry their words to unfriendly ears. Once they were gathered around a small fire that seemed to burn without fuel, Gandalf began to speak of things that had been hidden since the elder days. Long ago, when the world was younger and the Valar walked more freely among the children of Ilúvatar, there was forged a crown of such power that it could command the very elements themselves. It was made not by mortal hands, but by one of the Maiar who served Aule the smith in the halls of Mandot. Thorek leaned forward, his attention caught by the mention of his people's patron, Vala. What became of this crown? It was given to the first king of the Northmen, he who ruled over all the lands between the Misty Mountains and the Sea of Rune. With its power, he bound the ancient evils that stirred in the deep places of the world, creating a network of prisons and guardians that kept the darkness at bay. Gandalf paused to draw upon his pipe, the smoke curling upward in patterns that seemed almost like runes written upon the air. But power corrupts, as it ever does, and the king's heirs grew greedy. They sought to use the crown not to protect, but to conquer. The crown was lost in a great battle, and with it, the bindings that held the ancient evils began to weaken. "And my great-grandfather found it," Thorek said, understanding beginning to dawn upon him. "Nay," Gandalf replied, shaking his head. "He found something far more dangerous. He found the echo of it, a reflection created by the crown's power that contained a fragment of its essence. That echo carried with it a curse designed to prevent any from claiming the crown's power for selfish ends." Aldrich spoke up from where he sat, sharpening his sword. "Then the curse was meant to protect?" "Indeed, but like all such magic, it required a price. The curse would pass down through the bloodline of the one who disturbed it, creating guardians who could not be corrupted by gold's allure. For only one who truly despised gold could hope to resist the crown's temptation when the time came to face it." Thorek felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. The shadow bearer we saw in the ruins, it has the crown? "One of the 9, Gandalf confirmed grimly. "A Nazgul, though not one of the original ring-bearer. This is one of the new ones, created in the dying days of Sauron's power, when he sought to forge new servants from the spirits of ancient kings. It seeks to use the crown to break the remaining bindings and release the things that were imprisoned in the early days of the world." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and each of them contemplated the magnitude of what they faced. Finally, Thorek spoke. "What must be done?" Gandalf's eyes met his, and in them the dwarf saw both compassion and inexorable purpose. "The crown must be destroyed, and only one of your bloodline can do it. But the price." The wizard's voice trailed off. "What price?" Thorek demanded. "The curse that protects you from gold's corruption will be broken when you touch the crown. In that moment, you will feel its full power, its promise of dominion over all the earth. And you must choose. Claim that power for yourself, or cast it into the fires of Mount Doom, where it can be unmade forever." Thorek was quiet for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Then that is what must be done. But how do we find this Nazgul? The Grey Mountains stretch for hundreds of leagues." "We do not need to find it," Gandalf replied, "for it comes to us. Even now, it travels toward the ancient dwarf hold of Gundabad, where it believes the final binding can be broken. If we ride hard, we can reach the mountain before it completes its work." As they prepared to depart, Gandalf drew Thorek aside. "There is one more thing you must know," the wizard said quietly. "The spirits imprisoned by the crown's power, they are not mere demons or wraiths. They are the Umiar, the corrupted Maiar, who served Melkor in the days before the world's making. If they are freed, they will make Sauron seem like a petty tyrant by comparison." Thorek gripped his axes tighter. "Then they will not be freed. Whatever the cost, they will remain bound." Gandalf nodded approvingly, spoken like a true son of Durin. "But remember, Thorek Goldsbane, courage alone will not suffice in what is to come. You must be willing to sacrifice not just your life, but your very soul, if need be." As they rode north toward Mount Gundabad, where ancient evils stirred beneath the stone, none of them noticed the small winged shapes that followed in their wake, carrying word of their movements to darker powers that waited in the deep places of the world. Mount Gundabad reared before them like a broken fang against the storm-laden sky, its slopes scarred by centuries of war and strife. Once it had been the birthplace of Durin the Deathless, father of the Longbeard, but those days of glory were long past. Now it stood as a monument to corruption, its halls defiled by orcs and darker things. As they approached the mountain through the gray light of dawn, the signs of the Nazgul's presence became unmistakable. The very air seemed poisoned, and the hardy mountain grass had withered and died in great circles around the ancient gates. Worse still were the sounds that echoed from within, not the crude bellowing of orcs, but something far more ominous, the sound of chanting in languages that predated the awakening of the elves. Gandalf dismounted and approached the great stone doors that had once welcomed dwarf lords returning from their labors. The carvings that adorned them told the story of Durin's awakening and the founding of the Seven Clans. But now those noble images were marred by newer symbols, twisted runes that hurt to look upon, and spoke of binding and summoning. "The ritual has begun," the wizard said grimly, "but it is not yet complete. There is still time, but not much." Aldrich and his rangers had taken positions around the entrance, their weapons ready, but their faces grim. They all knew that steel would avail little against the forces they faced within the mountain. "How do we enter?" Thorek asked, studying the massive doors. "Those portals were made to withstand the assault of armies." "There are other ways," Gandalf replied. "This mountain is honeycombed with passages, and I know them well. But the path I have in mind is dangerous. It will take us through the deep places where even orcs fear to tread." He led them around the mountain's base to a narrow crack in the stone, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The opening exhaled a breath of air so foul that even the hardy rangers drew back, coughing. "The old mine workings," Gandalf explained. "They connect to the main halls, but the path runs close to other things that were sealed away for good reason." One by one, they squeezed through the opening and found themselves in a tunnel carved from the living rock. The walls bore the marks of dwarf tool, but they were old, older than any workings Thorek had ever seen. The style was archaic, speaking of the earliest days when his people first learned to delve deep into the earth's bone. As they made their way through the winding passage, guided by the soft light of Gandalf's staff, the sounds of the ritual above grew stronger. The chanting had taken on a rhythmic quality, and with it came other sounds, the crack of breaking stone and the rush of released air, as if great chambers long sealed were being opened. "The bindings weaken," Gandalf murmured. "We must move faster." But speed was difficult in the narrow tunnels, and they were forced to proceed in single file. Thorek, walking behind the wizard, began to notice things that filled him with unease. The rock around them was not merely old, it was wrong somehow, shot through with veins of metal that gleamed with an unnatural light. And the deeper they went, the more the walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched the chanting above. It was Aldrich who first noticed they were no longer alone in the tunnels. His sharp ears caught the sound of movement behind them, not the clumsy stumbling of orcs, but something that moved with predatory grace. "We are followed," he whispered to Gandalf. The wizard paused and listened, his face growing grave. "Barrow Wights," he said quietly. "The Nazgul has awakened more than just the ancient bindings. The very dead of Gundabad rise to serve it." As if summoned by his words, pale lights began to flicker in the tunnel behind them, and with them came a cold that bit deeper than winter wind. The voices of the dead began to whisper in the darkness, speaking words in languages that had not been heard since the elder days. "Run!" Gandalf commanded, and they needed no urging. The tunnel system became a maze of terror as they fled through the ancient working, pursued by spirits that had no place in the living world. The Barrow Wights flowed after them like a tide of malevolence, their touch bringing numbing cold and despair to any who felt it. But Thorek noticed something strange as they ran. The metal veins in the walls were growing brighter, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match his own heartbeat. And the familiar revulsion he felt toward gold was growing stronger, as if they were approaching its source. Finally, they burst through a concealed doorway into one of the main halls of Gundabad and found themselves in the midst of a scene from nightmare. The great chamber stretched away before them, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. At its center stood an altar of black stone, and upon that altar lay the crown of the Northmen, blazing with golden fire. Around the altar, a circle of orcs chanted in unison, their voices guided by the tall figure of the Nazgul. But it was what stood beyond the altar that filled Thorek with dread. 3 great doors of adamant, each sealed with runes of binding and protection. And those doors were cracking, hairline fractures spreading across their surfaces as the ritual weakened the ancient magic that held them closed. The Umayyar, Gandalf breathed. If those doors fail, his words were cut off as the Nazgul became aware of their presence. It turned from the altar, and though its face was hidden beneath its hood, Thorek could feel the weight of its attention like a physical blow. So, it spoke, its voice like the whisper of wind through tombs. The Guardian comes at last. How fitting that one who despises gold should be here to witness its ultimate triumph. The chanting of the orcs reached a crescendo, and the cracks in the adamant doors spread further. Beyond them, something stirred, something that had been sleeping since the world was young, and whose awakening would bring darkness beyond imagining. Thorek gripped his axes and stepped forward, knowing that the moment of choice had finally arrived. Behind him, Gandalf raised his staff, its light blazing forth to drive back the shadows. Beside them, the Rangers drew their swords and prepared to sell their lives dearly. The final battle had begun. The battle raged through the ancient halls of Gundabad with a fury that shook the very foundations of the mountain. Gandalf's staff blazed with white fire as he drove back the pressing horde of orcs, while Aldrich and his rangers fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they faced their final hour. But it was Thorek who pressed forward through the melee, his twin axes, grief and woe, cutting a path toward the altar where the Nazgul waited. As he drew near to the crown of the Northmen, the familiar revulsion grew stronger, but with it came something unexpected, a pull, as if the cursed artifact were calling to him. The golden flames that wreathed it seemed to reach out like grasping fingers, and he could hear whispers that spoke not of greed or avarice, but of justice and the power to right ancient wrongs. "Do you feel it, son of Nali?" the Nazgul hissed as Thorek approached. "The crown calls to you, as it was always meant to. Your ancestor did not disturb it by chance. He was drawn there, guided by the same power that guides you now." The dwarf paused, his axes raised, but not yet striking. "You speak in riddles, shade." "Do I?" The Nazgul circled the altar, its movements fluid and hypnotic. "Tell me, Guardian, what do you know of the true history of your curse?" Behind them, the battle raged on, but here in the circle around the altar, a strange calm descended. The orcs drew back, creating a space where Dwarf and Nazgul could speak without interruption. "Your great-grandfather Nali was not greedy," the Shadow Wraith continued. "He was chosen. The crown needed a guardian, someone whose bloodline could resist its corruption long enough to serve its true purpose. The curse was not punishment, it was preparation." Thorek felt doubt gnawing at his resolve. What purpose? Look around you, fool. The doors weaken, the ancient bindings fail. Soon the Umayyar will wake, and when they do, only the crown's power can send them back to their prison. That has always been its true purpose, not to rule, but to guard. And you, last of your line, are its chosen wielder. The cracks in the adamant doors were spreading faster now, and through the growing gap, a red light began to seep, the light of fires that had burned since the world's making. With that light came whispers in the black speech, words of hatred and malice that promised vengeance upon all who lived beneath the sun and stars. "You lie," Thorek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Do I? Then explain why the curse protected your bloodline rather than destroying it. Explain why you were drawn here, to this place, at this time. Explain why the crown calls to you even now." As if to underscore the Nazgul's words, the golden flames of the crown pulsed brighter, and Thorek felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and claim it. In his mind, he could see visions of what he could accomplish with such power. The orcs, driven from every mountain, the ancient dwarf holds restored to their former glory, peace and prosperity for all the free peoples of Middle-earth. But then another voice spoke from behind him, clear and strong despite the chaos of battle. "Do not listen to its words, Thorek Goldsbane." Gandalf strode through the press of combat, his staff sweeping aside orcs like leaves before a gale. "The crown's power comes with a price that no mortal was meant to pay." The Nazgul hissed like a serpent. "The gray fool knows nothing of true power. I offer you the chance to save not just this world, but to remake it according to your will. Think of the justice you could dispense, the wrongs you could right, and think of what you would become in the process." Gandalf countered. "The crown's power is seductive precisely because it offers what seems to be good. But power over others, no matter how nobly intended, corrupts the one who wields it. That is the lesson your ancestors learned, and why the crown was hidden away." Thorek looked from wizard to wraith, his mind torn between competing truths. The cracks in the doors were now wide enough that he could see movement beyond them, vast shapes stirring in the red darkness, growing stronger with each passing moment. "Choose quickly," the Nazgul urged. "Soon it will be too late for any choice at all." But as Thorek reached toward the crown, his hand stopped just short of its blazing surface. In the golden flames, he saw not visions of glory and justice, but something else entirely. He saw his great-grandfather, Nali, standing in a chamber deep beneath Erebor, his face not twisted with greed, but filled with terrible understanding. "You saw it too, didn't you, old ancestor?" he whispered. "You saw what the crown really was." The vision in the flames shifted, showing him the truth that had been hidden for 3 generations. Nali had not found the crown's echo by accident. He had been led there by the crown itself, which had sensed the growing weakness in the ancient binding. But when he touched it, he had seen not just its power, but its price. The curse had not been punishment for greed, but a desperate attempt to create guardians who could resist temptation when the final test came. Each generation of his family had been shaped by the curse, prepared for this moment when one of them would have to choose between ultimate power and ultimate sacrifice. "I understand now," Thorek said, and his voice carried a certainty that cut through the chaos like a blade. The crown was never meant to be used. It was meant to be destroyed, and only one who truly despised gold could bring himself to destroy such a treasure. The Nazgul shrieked in fury. "Fool! You would doom the world to save your precious principles." But Thorek was already moving, his axes raised not to claim the crown, but to shatter it. The golden flames reached out to stop him, promising him everything he had ever dreamed of. But the curse that had tormented his bloodline for 3 generations now became its salvation. Where others would have hesitated, seized by avarice, he struck without pause. The axes, grief and woe, forged in the depths of Erebor and tempered with dwarvish skill, struck the crown of the Northmen with a sound like breaking world. The moment Thorek's axe struck the crown of the Northmen, the world seemed to hold its breath. For an instant that stretched like eternity, the golden flames froze in place, the chanting of the orcs cut off mid-word, and even the red light seeping through the cracked doors dimmed to darkness. Then the crown exploded. The blast of golden fire that erupted from the shattered artifact was unlike anything seen in Middle-earth since the breaking of Thangorodrim. It swept outward in a wave of pure force that hurled orcs against the walls like ragdoll and sent even the mighty Nazgul staggering backward, its hood thrown back to reveal the terrible emptiness beneath. But the destruction of the crown had consequences far beyond the mere released stored power. As the golden flames died away, Thorek felt the curse that had plagued his bloodline for 3 generations suddenly lift from his shoulder like a great weight being removed. For the first time in his life, The sight of gold did not fill him with revulsion, and in that moment of liberation, he understood the true magnitude of what he had just done. The crown of the Northmen had not merely been a powerful artifact, it had been the keystone that held together the entire network of bindings created in the Elder Days. Without it, every prison, every seal, every ward that had been created to hold back the ancient darkness began to weaken and fail. "What have you done?" the Nazgul shrieked, its voice rising to a pitch that made the stone walls crack. "Without the crown's power, the bindings cannot hold. You have doomed us all." But even as the wraith spoke, Gandalf's voice rang out clear and strong above the chaos. "Nay, servant of darkness, the crown was never the true source of the binding's power. It was merely their focus, their anchor in the physical world. But the real strength of the ancient wards came from something far greater, the willing sacrifice of those who forged them." The wizard strode through the settling dust, his staff blazing with renewed light. "The crown's destruction does not weaken the bindings, Shadow Spawn. It completes them, for only through the freely chosen sacrifice of its last guardian could the ancient magic be fully activated." As if to prove his words, the cracks in the adamant doors began to seal themselves. The red light faded, and the whispers of the Umayyad grew fainter with each passing moment. The network of prisons and wards, rather than failing, was being renewed and strengthened by Thorek's act of selfless destruction. The Nazgul staggered as if struck by a physical blow. Impossible. The prophecies spoke of the crown's need, of its role in maintaining the ancient order. "The prophecies spoke truly," Gandalf replied, "but you understood them as only a creature of shadow could, through the lens of power and domination. You saw the crown as a tool to be wielded, not as a sacrifice to be made." Thorek, still reeling from the shock of the crown's destruction and the lifting of his family's curse, began to understand the true scope of what had occurred. "The curse," he said slowly, "it wasn't just to protect us from gold's corruption. It was to ensure that when the time came, one of our line would be capable of destroying the crown rather than claiming it." "Just so," Gandalf confirmed. "Your great-grandfather Nali saw this truth when he first touched the crown's echo. He understood that the curse was not punishment, but preparation. Each generation of your family was shaped and tempered, made ready for this moment when the choice would come between personal power and the greater good." The battle around them was winding down as the surviving orcs, deprived of their master's will, fled in terror. The rangers pursued them, but Aldrich remained behind, his sword still drawn as he watched the Nazgul warily. "If the bindings are renewed," the ranger asked, "what becomes of this creature?" The Nazgul had drawn back to the edge of the great chamber, its form seeming to waver and fade as the crown's destruction weakened its hold on the physical world. "This is not ended," it hissed. "There are other artifacts, other sources of power. The ancient darkness will find another way to freedom." But Gandalf shook his head. "Nay, Wraith, your time in this world is done. The crown was your anchor here, the source of the power that allowed you to manifest in physical form. Without it, you are but shadow and memory, unable to affect the waking world." Even as he spoke, the Nazgul's form began to dissolve, becoming increasingly translucent. Its final words echoed through the chamber like the last whisper of a dying wind. "This victory changes nothing. The shadow will return." And then it was gone, faded like mist before the morning sun. In the silence that followed, Thorek knelt and gathered up the fragments of the shattered crown. The metal still gleamed with its own inner light, but the terrible power that had once resided within it was gone. Now it was simply gold, beautiful, valuable, but no longer cursed. "What will you do with it?" Gandalf asked gently. Thorek smiled, and there was peace in his expression for the first time in his life. "I will take it home to Erebor, and I will forge from it something new, not a weapon or a tool of power, but a memorial, a reminder of the price that was paid to keep the darkness at bay." He looked around the ancient chamber, where the sealed doors of adamant stood as testimony to the renewed strength of the ancient binding. "My family's curse is broken. but our duty remains. We are still guardians, though of what, I am not yet certain." Gandalf's eyes twinkled with something that might have been approval. "The future will reveal that in its own time, Thorek, son of Nali. But for now, it is enough that you chose rightly when the choice mattered most." As they prepared to leave Gundabad behind, none of them noticed the small crack that had appeared in one of the adamant doors, a crack so tiny as to be almost invisible, but through which the faintest whisper of red light still flickered. The bindings had been renewed and strengthened. It was true, but even the mightiest chains could be worn away by time and patience. In the deep places of the world, ancient evils stirred and began to plan anew. The journey back to the lonely mountain took many days, for they traveled by paths less direct than those they had taken in their haste to reach Gundabad. Gandalf led them through hidden ways known only to himself, paths that wound through secret valleys and over forgotten passes where the very air seemed cleaner, as if the renewal of the ancient binding had lifted some invisible pall from the world. During the long hours of travel, Thorek found himself changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. The lifting of his family's curse had not merely freed him from his revulsion toward gold, it had opened his senses to aspects of the world that had been hidden from him before. He could feel the pulse of life in the earth beneath his feet, could sense the flow of ancient powers through the bones of the mountains themselves. "It is the awakening of your true heritage," Gandalf explained when Thorek spoke of these new perceptions. "Your bloodline carries more than dwarfish strength and skill. There is Maiar blood in your vein, distant but true, inherited from the earliest days when the boundaries between the peoples of Middle-earth were less rigid." "Maiar blood?" Aldrich asked, intrigued. "How can that be?" "In the elder days," the wizard replied, "when the Valors still walked openly in Middle-earth, there were unions between the lesser Ainur and the children of Ilúvatar that produced offspring of remarkable ability. Most such bloodlines have faded over the long ages, their special gifts diluted by time and distance. But occasionally, when great need arises, the ancient heritage awakens." Thorek pondered this as they made camp one evening in a sheltered valley where a clear stream ran between banks carpeted with soft moss. The fragments of the crown of the Northmen lay wrapped in his pack, and from time to time he found his hand drifting toward them, not with the old revulsion, but with a sense of anticipation he did not fully understand. That night, as the others slept, he unwrapped the golden pieces and spread them before him in the firelight. They were beautiful, he realized, not with the harsh, grasping beauty that had characterized the crown in its complete form, but with something soft, more natural. It was as if the destruction of the artifact had freed the gold itself from the burden of the power it had been forced to contain. "You begin to see it as it truly is," Gandalf said softly. And Thorek looked up to find the wizard seated across the fire from him, his pipe glowing in the darkness. "I don't understand what's happening to me," Thorek admitted. "All my life, gold has been my enemy, the source of my family's suffering. But now you see it as the Valor intended it to be seen," Gandalf finished. "Not as a tool of power or an object of greed, but as one of the many beautiful things that were made to delight the hearts of the children of Ilúvatar. The curse that protected you from corruption has been lifted, but the wisdom it taught remains." The wizard leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at those fragments?" Thorek studied the pieces of gold, letting his newly awakened senses extend toward them. "I see patterns," he said slowly. "Not the crown as it was, but as it could be. I see rings and chains, ornaments and decoration, but also..." He paused, struggling to put the vision into words. Also tools, not weapons, but instruments of making, as if the gold itself wants to be shaped into things that will help rather than harm." Gandalf nodded approvingly. "The seeing gift awakens in you. It is a rare talent. Even among the Eldar, you perceive not just what is, but what could be, the potential that lies sleeping within all things, waiting for the right hand to awaken it." Over the following days, as they drew nearer to Erebor, Thorek found himself studying the fragments of the crown with increasing fascination. Patterns emerged in his mind, not random designs, but purposeful forms that spoke to him of his people's ancient crafts and the deeper mysteries of their making. When at last they stood before the great gates of the lonely mountain, Thorek felt as if he were seeing his ancestral home with new eyes. The mountain itself seemed to pulse with life, its stone veins carrying currents of power that fed into the vast network of halls and chambers within. King Dain Ironfoot himself came to greet them, for word of their quest had preceded them through the swift messengers of the ranger. The old dwarf lord looked upon Thorek with eyes that held both respect and curiosity. "So," Dain rumbled, "the Goldsbane returns, and the curse of his line is broken. Tell me, cousin, what will you do now that gold no longer torments you? Will you take up the normal pursuits of our people, mining and trade, and the accumulation of wealth?" Thorek smiled and shook his head. "Nay, my king, the curse is lifted, but the purpose it served remains. I am still a guardian, though of what I am only beginning to understand." He opened his pack and showed Dain the fragments of the crown. The king's eyes widened as he beheld the pieces, for even in their broken state, they radiated a beauty that went beyond mere craftsmanship. "What will you do with them?" Dain asked. "I will forge them into something new," Thorek replied. "Not a weapon or a crown or any tool of power, but something that will serve the true purpose for which gold was created, to bring beauty and wonder into the world." And so it was that Thorek Goldsbane, last of his cursed line, and first of a new heritage, took up residence in the deep forges of Erebor and began the work that would occupy the rest of his days. But as he worked, hammering the golden fragments into new shapes, he could not shake the feeling that his true task was only beginning. For in the deepest chambers of the mountain, where even the bravest dwarves feared to tread, something ancient stirred, something that had been sleeping since the earliest days of the world, and which the destruction of the crown had begun to awaken. The network of bindings still held, but they were not as strong as they had once been, and in the darkness beyond them, patient and eternal, the first of the Umayyar began to dream of freedom once more. In the lowest levels of Erebor, where the mountain's roots delved deepest into the earth's bones, lay forges that had not been used since the days of Durin, the Deathless. Here, in chambers lit only by the red glow of molten rock that seeped through cracks in the living stone, the greatest works of dwarvish craft had been born. Artifacts of such beauty and power that their like would never be seen again in Middle-earth. It was here that Thorek chose to work with the fragments of the crown of the Northmen, far from the curious eyes of his kinfolk and the daily bustle of the mountain's populated halls. The deep forges had called to him with a voice he could not ignore, their ancient anvils singing with harmonies that resonated in his newly awakened blood. For weeks he labored in solitude, learning to work gold as he never had before. The metal seemed almost alive beneath his hammer, responding not just to his skill but to his intent. Where once he had shaped steel and iron through strength and technique alone, now he found that the gold required something more, a joining of mind and heart with the material itself. "You work as the first smiths worked," Gandalf said one day, appearing in the doorway of the forge as silently as morning mist, not merely shaping metal, but awakening the music that sleeps within it. Thorek paused in his hammering and wiped the sweat from his brow. Before him on the anvil lay his work, a chain of golden links, each one inscribed with runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. But it was not yet complete, and he could feel that something was still missing. "I don't understand what I'm making," he admitted to the wizard. "My hands know the movements, my mind grasps the patterns, but the purpose eludes me." Gandalf approached the anvil and studied the chain with eyes that held depths of ancient knowledge. "The gold remembers," he said finally. "It recalls the purpose for which it was first drawn from the earth, before it was bound into the crown's corrupted form. You are not making something new, Thorek. You are restoring something very old." "But what?" Before Gandalf could answer, a sound echoed through the deep forges that made both dwarf and wizard freeze in alarm. It was a sound like singing, but wrong. A melody that had been twisted until it became a lament of loss and bitter longing. And with that sound came a cold that had nothing to do with the deep places of the earth. "The Umayyar stir," Gandalf said grimly. "The destruction of the crown has not freed them, but it has loosened their bonds. They reach out through the cracks in their prison, seeking any anchor they can find in the waking world." As if summoned by his words, shadows began to gather in the corners of the forged chamber. Not natural shadows cast by flame and stone, but things that moved with purpose and malevolent intelligence. From within those shadows came voices that spoke in languages that predated the awakening of the elves. "Give us form, child of stone and fire," they whispered. "We who were mighty before the world was made, we who served the great music before it was corrupted by lesser voices. We offer you knowledge beyond the dreams of mortals, the secrets of creation itself." Thorek gripped his hammer tighter, feeling the pull of those voices like a tide trying to drag him under. The shadows reached toward the golden chain on his anvil, and where they touched, the metal grew cold and began to tarnish. "Do not listen to them," Gandalf commanded, his staff blazing to life with white fire that drove the shadows back. "They speak half-truths wrapped in lies. They were indeed mighty once, but they chose to corrupt their gifts in service to Melkor. What they offer now is not knowledge, but damnation." But the voices were seductive, speaking directly to the part of Thorek's heritage that resonated with the ancient powers. "We know you, grandson of starlight, heir to the first song. The blood of the Maiar flows in your veins, as it flows in ours. You cannot deny your true nature forever." "My true nature," Thorek said firmly, raising his hammer to strike the anvil, "is to create, not destroy, to build up, not tear down. That is the path I choose." He brought the hammer down upon the golden chain, and as he did so, the runes inscribed upon its links blazed to life with such brilliance that even the shadows of the Umayyar were forced to retreat. The sound that rang from the anvil was not the simple clang of metal on metal, but something far grander, a note of music so pure and beautiful that it seemed to resonate in the very foundations of the world. The voices of the imprisoned Umayyar rose to a shriek of fury and frustration, then faded as the light of the golden chain drove them back to their prison. But their final words carried a promise that chilled Thorek's heart. "This is not ended, young smith. We are patient as mountains, enduring as stars. We will find another way." When the shadows had fully retreated, and the forge chamber was once again lit only by the red glow of molten stone, Gandalf approached the anvil and gazed upon what Thorek had wrought. The golden chain lay before them, its links gleaming with an inner fire that was warm rather than harsh, beautiful rather than overwhelming. "Now I understand," the wizard said softly. "You have not simply reforged the crown's gold. You have transformed it into its true purpose. This chain is not a binding made to hold prisoner, but a connection designed to link the free peoples of Middle-earth together in common cause." Thorek lifted the chain, marveling at how light it felt, despite its obvious strength. Each link bore runes that spoke of friendship, loyalty, and mutual aid, concepts that were the antithesis of the domination the crown had represented. "But what is it for?" he asked. "That," Gandalf replied with a smile, "remains to be seen. But I suspect we will not have long to wait for the answer. The Umayyar's attempt to corrupt your work has failed, but it has also revealed their growing strength. They may be imprisoned, but their influence still reaches into the world, and there are those who might yet be swayed by their promises." As if to underscore his words, a horn sounded from the upper halls of Erebor, not the ceremonial horns used for daily business, but the deep war horns that had not been blown since the Battle of 5 Armies. Something was coming to the Lonely Mountain, and it did not come in peace. Thorek carefully wrapped the golden chain in soft cloth and secured it in his pack. Whatever was approaching, he had a feeling that his newly forged work would play a crucial role in the confrontation to come. The deep forge fell silent as dwarf and wizard made their way toward the upper hall, but in the shadows they left behind, something lingered, a presence that had been drawn by the sound of the golden chains forging, and which watched their departure with eyes that held the cold light of distant stars. The true test of Thorek's transformation was yet to come. The great hall of Erebor rang with the sound of armored feet as dwarves prepared for war. King Dain stood upon the dais, where the Arkenstone had once gleamed, his war hammer in his hands and his face grim beneath his iron crown. Before him stood the captains of his guard, their faces reflecting the same tension that filled the air like the charge before a thunderstorm. "Report!" the king commanded, as Thorek and Gandalf entered the hall. Captain Nori, eldest of the scouts, stepped forward with news that chilled the hearts of all who heard it. "My lord, a great host marches from the east, men of Rhûn and Khan, led by chieftains who claim dominion over all the lands between the Sea of Rhûn and the Grey Mountain. But they are not the true enemy." He paused, his weathered face pale with what he had witnessed. "They are led by one who wears the seeming of a man, but whose shadow falls wrong upon the ground. The very earth withers beneath his feet, and his voice carries the promise of power to any who will serve him." Gandalf's staff grew brighter as understanding dawned in his ancient eyes. One of the Umair has found a way to manifest in physical form. The bindings still hold their true essence prisoner, but they have learned to create avatars, limited manifestations that can walk in the world of the living. Thorek felt the weight of the golden chain in his pack, and with it came a strange certainty. This avatar, does it seek something specific, or does it merely come to conquer? "It speaks of a great working," Nori replied, "a ritual that will restore the ancient order and bring about a new age where the worthy shall rule and the weak shall serve. It promises its followers dominion over all the lands of Middle-earth, if they will but aid it in finding its seek." "And what does it seek?" Dain demanded. The scout's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The fragments of the crown of the Northmen, my lord. It knows they were brought here, and it will not be turned aside." A silence fell over the great hall as all eyes turned to Thorek. The dwarf felt the weight of their expectation, but also something else, a growing awareness of the pattern that was emerging, the shape of events that had been set in motion by his choice to destroy the crown rather than claim its power. "The chain," he said quietly to Gandalf. "This is why it was forged, isn't it? Not as a weapon to fight the Avatar, but as something else entirely." The wizard nodded gravely. The destruction of the crown did not simply free its gold from corruption. It transformed the very nature of its power. Where once it sought to dominate and control, now it seeks to connect and unite. The Avatar knows this and fears what such a transformation might mean. King Dain stepped down from his dais, his eyes fixed on Thorek, with an intensity that spoke of dawning understanding. "You speak of unity, wizard, but unity of what? We are prepared to fight. But this enemy comes with numbers greater than we can match. Even with all our allies, numbers will not avail us," Gandalf replied. "This is not a battle to be won by strength of arms alone. The Avatar draws its power from division, from the fear and mistrust that separates the peoples of Middle-earth. It feeds on our isolation, growing stronger with each group that stands alone against it." Thorek pulled the golden chain from his pack, unwrapping it carefully in the light of the Great Hall's torches. The runes upon its links seemed to pulse with renewed life, and as the assembled dwarves looked upon it, each saw something different. Visions of friendship and alliance, of old grievances set aside in favor of common cause. "This is what the Avatar truly fears," Thorek said, his voice carrying through the hall with surprising strength. "Not a weapon, but a symbol. A reminder that we are stronger together than we can ever be apart." As if summoned by his words, messengers began to arrive in rapid succession. First came riders from Dale, their horses lathered with sweat from hard travel, bearing word from King Brand that his city was prepared to stand with Erebor. Then came the wood elves of Thranduil, their approach so silent that they seemed to materialize from the very shadows of the hall. But it was the final messenger who brought the most surprising news. She entered the hall without ceremony, her travel-stained cloak marking her as one who had ridden far and fast. But when she threw back her hood, gasps echoed through the chamber, for she bore the star of the Dunedain upon her brow. "I am Gilraen, daughter of Dirhael, ranger of Eriador," she announced in a voice that carried the authority of ancient nobility. "I come bearing word from the Shire, from Rohan, from Gondor itself." The Avatar's servants moved not just against Erebor, but against all the free people. Already, they have sent agents to stir up old resentments, to convince each people that they stand alone against the gathering darkness. She approached the dais where Thorek stood with his golden chain, and in her eyes, he saw recognition of something she had been told to watch for. "But there is hope," she continued. "Across all the lands of Middle-earth, there are those who remember the lessons of the War of the Ring. They know that only in unity can we stand against such evil. They wait only for a signal, a sign that will unite them in common cause." Thorek looked down at the chain in his hands, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as a responsibility. The pattern was becoming clear now, the purpose for which it had been forged revealing itself at last. "A signal," he repeated slowly. "Yes, I begin to see." He moved to the great window of the hall, where the evening light streamed in across the gathered assembly. There, in sight of all, he held up the golden chain, letting its light catch and reflect the dying sun. "Let word go forth," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of his newly awakened heritage, "to Dale and the woodland realm, to Rohan and Gondor, to the Shire, and all the lands between. The chain is forged, and the time of unity has come. Let all who would stand for freedom gather at the lonely mountain, for here we will make our stand, not as separate peoples, but as one." The chain blazed with golden fire as he spoke, its light visible even to those standing outside the mountain's halls. And across Middle-earth, in kingdoms far and near, that light was seen and understood. The call had gone out, and those who loved freedom began to make ready for the final confrontation. But in the east, the Avatar of the Umayyad felt that blazing light like a physical blow. Its plans for conquest through division had been thwarted, and now it would have to face the united strength of the free people. For the first time since its manifestation, the Shadow Being knew something approaching fear. In all the long history of Middle-earth, no gathering had ever matched the one that assembled at the foot of the lonely mountain in the days that followed Thorek's call. From every corner of the known world, the free peoples came, not as separate armies bent on their own purposes, but as allies united by a common cause. The men of Dale came first, led by King Brand himself, their banners streaming in the mountain wind. Close behind came the elves of the woodland realm, moving with the silent grace that had marked their kind since the elder days. Thranduil himself rode at their head, his crown of autumn leaves catching the morning light. From the south came riders bearing the white tree of Gondor, led by a lord whose bearing spoke of the ancient nobility of Numenor. With them rode the Rohirrim, their horses' hooves drumming like thunder on the plain, and their golden banners bright as the sun itself. But perhaps most surprising of all was the contingent from the Shire. 100 hobbits marched behind a banner bearing the device of the Green Dragon, led by none other than Samwise Gamgee himself, now mayor of the Shire for the third time, and still bearing Sting at his side. "Well, Master Thorek," Sam said, as he presented himself to the dwarf who had called them all together, "it seems you've stirred up quite the hornet's nest. But if there's darkness afoot that threatens the peace of the Shire, then you'll find no stouter allies than the folk of the Four Farthing." Each group that arrived brought news of the Avatar's growing influence. Its servants had spread across Middle-earth like a plague, whispering promises of power to those who felt themselves wronged, stoking ancient grievances between peoples who had learned to trust each other. "It seeks to break the bonds forged in the War of the Ring," Gandalf explained to the assembled leaders as they gathered in the great tent that had been erected to serve as their war council. "The Avatar knows it cannot defeat us if we stand united, so it works to turn us against each other. Thorax stood at the center of the gathering, the golden chain draped across the table before him, like a map of the alliances that had been forged. Each link seemed to pulse with its own light, connecting not just physically but spiritually to the representatives of the various peoples. Then we must ensure that those bonds cannot be broken, he said firmly. But how do we fight an enemy that strikes not with sword and spear, but with whispers and false promises? It was Thranduil who answered, his ancient voice carrying the wisdom of millennia. We fight lies with truth, shadow with light, but most importantly, we fight together. The Avatar's greatest weapon is our separation. Remove that, and it becomes merely another fallen Maya, powerful, but not invincible. As they spoke, scouts brought word that the enemy host was drawing near. The Avatar's army was indeed vast. Men of Rune and Khand marched under banners that bore twisted versions of their ancestral devices, their eyes holding the fanatical gleam of those who had been promised dominion over others. But it was not their numbers that concerned the defenders most. It was the reports of what marched beside them, creatures of shadow that had been given form through the Avatar's power, beings that seemed to be made of living darkness and fed on fear itself. The Avatar grows stronger, Gandalf observed grimly. Each person it corrupts, each bond of trust it breaks, adds to its power. If we are to defeat it, we must do so quickly, before it can complete whatever working it plans. The attack came at dawn, as the first light of the sun crested the peaks of the lonely mountain. The Avatar's host spread across the plain like a dark tide, their battle cries echoing off the stone walls of Dale. At their head rode the Avatar itself, taking the form of a tall figure clad in armor that seemed to be made of crystallized shadow. But the free people were ready. The defenses of Dale had been strengthened and reinforced, creating interlocking fields of fire that could channel the enemy's advance. More importantly, the various contingents had been organized not as separate forces, but as a single, unified army. Elven archers stood beside human spearmen. Dwarf warriors fought alongside hobbit archers, whose aim had been honed by years of hunting in the Shire's green field. The Rohirrim waited in reserve, ready to charge when the moment was right. And at the center of it all stood Thorak, the golden chain wound around his arm like a bracer, its light serving as a beacon that held the alliance together even in the chaos of battle. The fighting was fierce but brief. The Avatar's forces, expecting to face a divided enemy, found instead a unified defense that adapted and responded as a single organism. Where they pressed hard against the dwarf contingent, elven reinforcements appeared. Where they tried to outflank the men of Dale, hobbit archers emerged from concealed positions to pepper them with arrows. But the true battle was not being fought with sword and spear. As the armies clashed, the Avatar itself strode forward, its attention fixed not on the general melee, but on the dwarf who stood at the heart of the enemy formation. "So," it said, its voice carrying clearly over the din of combat, "the chain-bearer reveals himself at last. Do you think your little trinket can stand against the power of the firstborn children of thought?" Thorak stepped forward to meet it, the golden chain blazing with light that made the Avatar's shadow form waver and dim. "I think," he replied steadily, "that you have forgotten what true power looks like." The Avatar laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I am Tevildo the Mighty, greatest of cats, Lord of Shadows, servant of Melkor since before the making of the sun and moon. I have seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of stars. What can one insignificant dwarf hope to do against such as I?" But as it spoke, something began to happen that neither had expected. The golden chain in Thorak's hands began to sing, not with voice, but with a harmony that resonated through the very fabric of creation itself. And as it sang, it was joined by other voices, the battle songs of the dwarves, the fair melodies of the elves, the hearty chorus of men, and the simple, honest tunes of the hobbits. All around them, the forces of the free peoples began to sing as they fought, their voices joining in a great chorus that spoke not of conquest or domination, but of friendship, courage, and the simple desire to protect what they loved. The avatar staggered as if struck by a physical blow. "Impossible!" it shrieked. "The music is corrupted. It serves the will of power, not the weakness of love." But Thorek smiled, understanding finally dawning in his heart. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "The music serves neither power nor love alone. It serves something greater than both. It serves the free choice of all the children of creation to sing their own parts in the great symphony." The golden chain blazed with such brilliance that even the avatar was forced to shield its eyes. And in that moment, Thorek saw the truth that had been hidden since the very beginning. The avatar was not merely a servant of ancient evil, but something far more personal. The final revelation was at hand. As the golden chain blazed with light that seemed to come from the very heart of creation itself, the avatar's form began to waver and change. The armor of crystallized shadow fell away, revealing not the terrible majesty of a corrupted Maya, but something far more tragic and far more familiar. "Great-grandfather," Thorek whispered, his voice barely audible over the continuing battle. The figure that stood before him bore the face of Nali, the greedy, but twisted by centuries of torment and self-hatred. His eyes, once warm with dwarvish pride, now burned with the cold fire of one who had seen too much and understood too little. "Aye, child of my blood," Nali replied, his voice carrying the weight of ages. "Though I am not the ancestor you remember from the tale, I am what he became when he chose to bind his spirit to the crown rather than accept the curse it offered." Around them, the battle raged on, but in the space between Dwarf and Shade, time seemed to move differently. The golden chain pulsed with each word, its light revealing truths that had been hidden for 3 generations. "When I found the crown's echo in the deep places beneath Erebor," Nali continued, "I was given a choice. Accept the curse that would protect my bloodline from corruption, or bind myself to the crown's power and become its guardian in a different way. I chose what I thought was the noble path. I chose to sacrifice myself so that my descendants could be free." Thorek felt tears streaming down his face as understanding dawned. "But the crown's power corrupted you, turned you into something else entirely. Worse than that," Nali said bitterly. "It made me into its avatar, its voice in the world. For 3 generations, I have been the whisper in the darkness, the voice that calls to kings and chieftains with promises of power. I have sown discord among the free peoples, hoping that the resulting wars would weaken the bindings enough for the Umayyar to break free." The revelation struck Thorek like a physical blow. All the conflicts of recent years, all the suspicions and mistrust that had plagued the aftermath of the War of the Ring, his own great-grandfather had been the architect of it all. "But why?" he demanded. "Why would you serve those ancient evils?" Nali's shade looked down at hands that flickered between solid flesh and empty air. "Because they promised me what I desired most, freedom from the curse I had brought upon our line. They showed me visions of you, my descendant, living a life free from the burden of gold hatred. All I had to do was gather enough power to break the binding, and they would lift the curse forever. But that was a lie." Gandalf's voice cut through their conversation like a blade of light. The wizard strode through the battle line, his staff blazing with power that forced the lesser shadows to retreat. "The Umayyar cannot lift curses. They can only corrupt them. If you had succeeded in freeing them, the curse would have become something far worse." Nali turned to face the wizard, and in his eyes was a desperation that had been building for a century. "You speak of things you do not understand, Grey Fool. I have walked in darkness for 3 generations, sacrificing everything for my bloodline's freedom. And your bloodline freed themselves," Thorek said quietly, holding up the golden chain. "Not through your corruption and manipulation, but through choosing to destroy the very power you sought to claim. The curse was broken not by serving evil, but by rejecting it." The shade of Nali stared at the blazing chain, and for a moment, his corrupted features softened into something resembling the dwarf he had once been. "The curse is truly broken?" "Aye," Thorek replied, "but not in the way you thought it would be. It was never meant to be lifted from without. It could only be overcome from within by one who chose sacrifice over power, unity over dominion. Around them, the battle was turning. The Avatar's army, deprived of their leader's will and presence, began to waver and break. The creatures of shadow dissipated like morning mist, and the corrupted men of Rune and Khand looked around in confusion, as if waking from a long dream. But Nali's shade did not fade. Instead, he seemed to grow more solid, more real, as if the revelation of truth was giving him substance rather than destroying it. "If the curse is broken," he said slowly, "then my binding to the crown's power is also weakened. For the first time in 3 generations, I can choose my own path." The golden chain pulsed brighter, and Thorek felt a new understanding flow through him. The chain doesn't just bind the free peoples together, he realized. It can also bind the broken parts of our own history, heal the wounds that divide us from ourselves. He held out the chain toward his great-grandfather's shade, its links gleaming with warm, welcoming light. "You can choose redemption, ancestor. The path back to the light is still open, if you have the courage to take it." Nali hesitated, his form wavering between corruption and clarity. "The things I have done, the wars I have caused, the trust I have broken. How can such sins be forgiven?" "The same way all sins are forgiven," Gandalf said gently, "through acknowledgement, repentance, and the willing choice to do better. The dead cannot undo their actions, but they can ensure that their example serves the light rather than the darkness." With a cry that seemed to come from the very depths of his being, Nali reached out and grasped the golden chain. The moment his spectral fingers touched its links, light blazed forth with such intensity that the entire battlefield was illuminated as if by a second sun. In that light, 3 generations of lies and manipulation were burned away. The false promises that had turned brother against brother, the whispered doubts that had made allies into enemies, the corrupted dreams that had led the worthy into darkness, all of it dissolved before the truth that blazed from the chain. When the light faded, Nali stood before them, transformed. No longer a shade of corruption and bitter regret, he appeared as he had been in life, a dwarf of noble bearing, whose eyes held wisdom earned through suffering. "My task is finished," he said, his voice now free of the hollow echo that had marked his corrupted state. "The chain is complete, the unity restored. The Umayyad remain bound, their influence broken by the very weapon they sought to destroy." He looked around at the battlefield, where former enemies were laying down their arms and looking upon each other with eyes cleared of artificial hatred. This is how it should be, not one people ruling over another, but all peoples choosing their own destiny in harmony. Thorek stepped forward, and for the first time in his life, embraced his great-grandfather. "Your sacrifice was not in vain, ancestor. The curse you accepted became the very tool of our salvation." Nali smiled, and in that smile was peace that had been absent from his features for 100 years. "The music is healing itself," he said wonderingly. "Listen, can you hear it? The discord is resolved, the harmony restored." And indeed, across the battlefield and beyond, a new song was rising, not the forced unity of domination, but the chosen harmony of free peoples who had decided to sing together rather than apart. As the shade of Nali began to fade, not in defeat this time, but in fulfillment, he spoke his final words to his descendant. "Keep the chain, Thorek Goldsbane, but know that its greatest power lies not in binding others together, but in reminding each of us that we are never truly alone." The battle was over. The free peoples of Middle-earth stood united not by force or manipulation, but by their own free choice. And in the halls of Erebor, where the golden chain would be kept as a symbol of that unity, the story of the dwarf who hated gold became a legend that would be told for generations to come. But it was not an ending, it was a beginning. For the first time since the Elder Days, all the children of Iluvatar had chosen to sing in harmony, and their combined voices rose to the very halls of the Valar themselves, carrying news of hope renewed and darkness overcome. The music of creation played on, richer and more beautiful for the discord it had overcome. Epilogue, The song Eternal Years passed, and the golden chain remained in Erebor as both treasure and testament. Thorek, no longer called Goldsbane but now known as Chain Forger, became a bridge between people, his unique heritage allowing him to see the connections that bound all free beings together. The unity forged in that great battle did not break, though it was tested many times in the years that followed. When disputes arose between peoples, representatives would come to the Lonely Mountain to look upon the chain and remember the price of division. Gandalf, before his final departure over the sea, spoke words that became prophecy. As long as the free peoples remember that their strength lies in their choice to stand together, the darkness shall not return in force. The chain will endure not because it compels unity, but because it reminds us why unity is worth choosing. And in the deep places of the world, where the Umayyad remained bound by renewed seal, there was no longer the patient plotting of ancient malice, but only the slow acceptance of defeat. For they had learned at last that the greatest power in all creation was not the ability to command, but the willingness to serve something greater than oneself. The age of unity had begun, and Middle-earth sang with one voice forevermore. Thus ends the tale of Thorek Goldsbane, whose hatred of gold became love of fellowship, and whose broken chain became the unbreakable bond of freedom.